For 61-year-old Linda Carter, the world had grown quieter in recent years. Her home, a modest white cottage tucked beneath a canopy of oak trees in Springfield, Missouri, had once echoed with laughter, music, and the steady rhythm of another person's footsteps. Now, only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chime of the neighbor's wind bells reminded her that life was still moving, even when her heart sometimes wasn't. Linda was a widow, a kind one, the type who waved to mailmen and brought banana bread to the ladies at church. But beneath her calm, gray-eyed smile was a grief that never softened. Her baby boy, gone before he ever had a name. She remembered the day like a scar burned into her soul. The maternity ward at St. Vincent's Hospital was warm and full of light. Nurses bustled past with quiet urgency, and soft lullabies played on a speaker overhead. Linda had gone into labor earlier than expected. Brian had paced the hallway like a soldier waiting for the outcome of a battle. Then came the push, the cry, a glimpse, just a glimpse. They placed the baby on her chest for only a moment, red and wrinkled, wailing with lungs full of life. She looked down and saw his tiny fingers flexing, his mouth rooting blindly for comfort. "He has my nose," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. But before she could memorize the curve of his face, alarms began to wail. Red lights blinked on the ceiling. A nurse shouted something about a fire, a small one, probably an electrical short, nothing serious. But protocol was protocol. "We have to move," someone said. A mask was pressed to Linda's face. Oxygen. Then hands were pulling her stretcher toward the hallway. The baby was whisked in the opposite direction by a nurse in pink scrubs, her arms cradling him like porcelain. "I'll bring him right back," she promised. Linda never saw her again. The smoke grew thicker by the time they reached the stairwell. Evacuation was chaotic. She heard another mother screaming for her baby. Someone was coughing. An orderly tripped and dropped a clipboard that clattered down the stairs like thunder. She was sedated shortly after. For her safety, they said later. When she woke, the hospital room was cold and sterile. Brian sat beside her, his face ashen. There was a mix-up, he said, voice cracking. They couldn't save him. "Where is he?" she asked. No one ever gave her a body. No name. No footprints. Just a file marked deceased, male infant, and a nurse who wouldn't meet her eyes. They said the records were lost in the confusion. Linda had always tried to believe them. But for the next 3 decades, she lit a candle every year on October 15th, the day he was born and, as far as she was told, the day he died. She never stopped hearing that cry. Every year, on the evening of October 15th, Linda would turn off all the lights in her house. She'd set a single white candle on the kitchen windowsill, the one that faced east, where the sunrise used to hit the cradle they bought too soon. She never told anyone about this ritual. It wasn't for pity. It wasn't even for closure. It was for him. She'd sit in silence with a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the flame flicker like a heartbeat. In those moments, the house didn't feel so empty. She'd imagine the cries she never got to soothe, the tiny fingers she never got to kiss goodnight. She gave him names in her mind, different each year, as if trying on what might have been. Eli, Nathan, Samuel, James. She didn't know why that last one had always felt right. Sometimes she wrote him letters. Simple things. "You would have liked apple pie. Your father sang off key, but I think you'd have giggled at him. I wonder if you got my nose. I miss you, even though I never really had you." She kept them all in a shoebox labeled for the baby. No one ever saw it. After Brian passed away, she moved the box into the back of the closet, as if hiding it would dull the ache. But it never did. One year, after lighting the candle, she walked into the nursery. She'd never had the heart to turn into a guest room. It was mostly empty. Just a chair, a shelf, and a faded mobile with stars that no longer turned. She sat down, and whispered into the dark. If you're out there, if you ever feel lost, just know your mother's waiting. The flame behind her danced with the wind, but never went out. It happened 29 years ago. St. Vincent's Hospital caught fire the night after she gave birth. There had been chaos, evacuations, smoke, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a nurse told her that her newborn son didn't make it out. She never held him, never buried him, just lost him. Linda's husband, Brian, never recovered from the loss. Neither did their marriage. He passed away 10 years later from pancreatic cancer, leaving Linda with no children, no family, and no reason to expect anything more from life. Until James Taylor. She met him at a calligraphy class of all places. It was held at the community center every Tuesday evening. Mostly retired folks trying to keep their hands busy and their minds sharper. James, at 29, was the youngest person in the room by a solid 3 decades. Tall, lean, with thoughtful brown eyes and a half-smile that never quite reached his cheekbones, James stood out in every way. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. Linda assumed he was a volunteer at first, maybe a helper for the instructor. She never imagined he was there just like her, to fill time, to forget the silence at home, to feel like he belonged somewhere. They were partnered for a lettering exercise. Linda joked about her shaky lines, and James complimented her curves, of her letters at least. Their laughter came easy. From that day on, they always chose to sit together. Weeks passed, and Linda began to look forward to Tuesday nights in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. James started walking her to her car after class. One Saturday, they ran into each other at the farmer's market and ended up having coffee. The next weekend, dinner. By the time summer arrived, Linda realized her heart fluttered when he texted. Her friends noticed the glow in her cheeks. Some teased her, others raised eyebrows. Linda pretended not to notice the way her hands trembled whenever his name popped up on her phone screen. She told herself it was harmless, just infatuation, a flutter of joy after years of emotional drought. But deep down she knew it was more, and that terrified her. There were nights she'd sit alone on her porch, mug of tea going cold in her hands, asking herself questions she couldn't answer. Was she lonely or in love? Was this revival or a delusion? Was she foolish or just human? The mirror wasn't kind. It showed every line on her face, every gray hair, every reminder that she was a woman of 61, not 25, not 35, not anywhere near James's world. And yet, when he looked at her, he didn't see years. He saw her, and somehow, that felt more real than anything had in a long time. She'd buried her husband a decade ago, grieved properly, quietly. Everyone expected her to move on, but no one ever explained what that meant. She tried to volunteer, to bake, to keep busy, but nothing filled the hollowness of coming home to silence. Until James. The first time he touched her hand, just a casual brush of fingers when passing the sugar. Her whole body startled, as if waking from a long sleep. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, heart pounding like it hadn't in decades. Not since she was a young woman in love. Not since before the grief, before the fire, before the loss. She tried to talk herself out of it. She really did. He was 32 years younger. People would talk. Some already were. But James never made her feel small, or old, or ridiculous. He laughed at her jokes. He listened when she rambled. He brought her sunflowers on Thursdays, because roses are too serious, he said. He didn't pity her, didn't tiptoe around her widowhood, didn't treat her like she was fragile porcelain. He saw her, one evening, after a particularly long walk under the setting sun. He looked at her like she was the answer to a question he didn't know he'd been asking. And in that gaze, Linda felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself. But she was falling for him. And that truth, as soft and terrifying as it was, felt more alive than any church sermon or community brunch or banana bread bake-off ever could. Still, late at night, when the house was dark and the only sound was the hum of the fridge, Linda would whisper to the silence, "Please don't let this be a mistake." But James never made her feel embarrassed. Quite the opposite. "I like being around you," he told her one night over fried chicken and iced tea. "You're the first person who's ever made me feel safe." James had grown up in the foster care system. No parents, no siblings. Just a file, a birthday, and a childhood pass from home to home. His earliest memory was waking up in a stranger's house, clutching a blue blanket and wondering where his real mom was. "I used to imagine her," he admitted once. "Sometimes she had brown hair, other times red, but she always smelled like cinnamon and always told me I was special." Linda had to excuse herself that evening. She cried in the bathroom, not knowing why his story had pierced her so deeply. He rarely spoke about his childhood, and when he did, it came out in fragments. But over time, Linda pieced it together. He'd been in and out of 12 foster homes by the time he was 10. Some were decent, offering food, a bed, and silence. Others weren't. He never went into detail, but once, after a nightmare, he murmured something about being locked in a basement to teach him respect. Another time, he mentioned a family who returned him after 2 months because he didn't bond well with the other kids. The rejection stung more than the hunger, he once confessed. But there was one home, the Hendersons, who came close to adopting him when he was around 7. For 6 glorious months, he had his own room, a yellow bike with his name on it, and a mother figure who braided his hair and sang off-key lullabies at bedtime. They called him Jamie. He told Linda that was the first time he truly felt wanted. Then one morning, he was pulled from school early and taken back to the group home. The Hendersons had changed their minds. No explanation. Just a new social worker with a clipboard and tired eyes saying, "You'll be okay, Jamie." He wasn't. For years, he carried the blue blanket from that home like armor. It was the only thing that had ever smelled like family. When the fabric finally disintegrated in a laundromat dryer during his teenage years, "No one ever came back for me," he once said. That silence stayed with him through every move. What haunted him most wasn't the violence or the loneliness. It was the not knowing. Not knowing why his birth parents had vanished. Not knowing why no one ever claimed him. Not knowing why, even when he tried to be good, people still left. So when Linda didn't leave, when she smiled at his jokes and waited for him after class and remembered how he liked his coffee, something in him cracked open. She didn't remind him of a mother. She reminded him of home. Their bond deepened. They went to the county fair, danced in the kitchen, took road trips to little towns just for pie. Linda knew the world wouldn't understand. A 61-year-old woman and a 29-year-old man wasn't just unconventional. It was practically a scandal in Springfield. But love doesn't ask permission. When James proposed, it wasn't with a diamond ring or a grand speech. Just a quiet question on the porch one autumn evening, beneath the falling leaves. "Linda, I don't have a past, and I don't know much about where I come from. But if I get to choose where I go, I want to go there with you." She said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was small, 10 guests, a backyard, Linda in sky blue silk, James in gray slacks and suspenders. They danced barefoot to Unchained melody, and for the first time since she was a young woman, Linda felt like the universe hadn't forgotten her. They settled into a peaceful rhythm. James worked as a physical therapy assistant at a nearby clinic. Linda kept volunteering at the library. Every Sunday, she made pot roast. Every Tuesday, they still went to calligraphy class. He brought her flowers just because. She left notes in his lunchbox. Their love wasn't flashy or perfect. It was steady, comforting, healing. One evening, Linda sat on the couch, thumbing through a magazine article about inherited health risks. You know, she said, we should probably do one of those genetic screenings. My mom had breast cancer, and, well, you don't know your background. It might be good to know. James agreed easily. Could be interesting to see if I'm part Viking, he joked. They ordered a kit online, spit in tubes, sent them off, then forgot about it, until the phone rang 3 weeks later. Linda picked it up with a smile on her voice. That smile disappeared in seconds. Linda's hands trembled as she set the cordless phone back on its cradle. James looked up from the dining table, mid-sip of his tea. Who was it? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were distant, glassy. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. It was the lab, the genetic testing company. He raised an eyebrow. That was fast. I thought they said 4 to 6 weeks. They want us to come in. She paused. Together. James frowned. That's weird. Linda didn't say it out loud, but her gut twisted in ways she couldn't explain. There was something in the caller's tone, not alarmed exactly, but grave. Like he was delivering news he didn't want to say over the phone. The next morning, they drove in silence to the regional office of the genetic testing company. A technician met them at the door and ushered them into a private consultation room. A sterile little box with 2 chairs and a folder on the table. Is everything okay? James asked. The technician gave a tight-lipped smile. Dr. Singh will be with you shortly. When the door opened again, a woman in a white coat entered, carrying a tablet. She sat, folded her hands, and looked at them with clinical compassion. Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming. Linda nodded slowly. James straightened in his chair. I want to preface this by saying your health screenings came back without any immediate red flags, the doctor began. But something came up in the process, something we felt ethically obligated to discuss with you in person. James chuckled nervously. You're scaring me. Document. What is it? Dr. Singh tapped her tablet. We cross-reference genetic markers as part of the ancestry breakdown. Occasionally, we detect familial links, cousins, siblings, that sort of thing. In your case, we found a significantly high percentage of shared DNA. James blinked. Shared? You two share approximately 49.8% of your genome. Linda's breath caught in her throat. That's not possible, she whispered. Dr. Singh looked gently between them. This level of shared DNA typically indicates a parent-child relationship. Silence swallowed the room. James looked at Linda, confused, waiting for her to laugh it off, to tell the doctor she'd made a mistake. But Linda wasn't laughing. She was staring at the floor like her world had been kicked out from under her. I think there's been a mistake, Linda finally managed. I had a son. He died in a fire 29 years ago at St. Vincent's. The doctor nodded slowly. I understand. But if I may ask, did you ever receive a body? A death certificate? No, Linda whispered. They told me he died in the NICU. I was in a different wing. There was smoke. Alarms. They said they couldn't save him. James leaned forward. What's going on? Linda looked at him now, really looked, the slope of his nose, the curve of his cheekbone, the faint dimple on the left side when he was nervous. How had she not seen it before? No, she murmured again. No, this can't be. James stood. Linda, what is this? Are you saying? I don't know, she cried. I don't know what any of this means. But somewhere deep inside, a door creaked open, a memory, blurry and long buried. The baby boy she'd held for less than 5 minutes before being sedated. The confusion during the evacuation. The lack of records when she asked later. And the years of silence that followed. James backed away slowly. You think I'm your son? Neither of them said it. Neither of them wanted to. But the data sat there, cold and clinical, in the doctor's hands. The ride home was wordless. Linda sat on the edge of the bed for hours that night, staring at the photograph on her dresser, their wedding day, the sun painting golden light across their smiling faces. She thought of the joy she felt walking down that aisle, the warmth in James's touch, the laughter they'd shared. And now it all felt poisoned, twisted, wrong, but also heartbreakingly real. The next morning, Linda drove alone to the county records office. She requested access to hospital archives from 1996. Most have been transferred to state storage. She filed a request, gave her old patient number, and waited. That afternoon, she received a call. "Mrs. Carter, we found a supplemental incident report. It looks like your infant, baby boy Carter, was mislabeled during the fire. One male infant with no ID band was transferred out and later entered into the foster system as John Doe. That's now James Taylor's file." Linda collapsed to her knees in the kitchen. The baby they said had died hadn't. He had been taken, renamed, raised without knowing her, and then, somehow, had circled back into her life, not as a son, but as a man who'd fallen in love with her. James, in his own spiral, had driven 2 hours to the only orphanage he remembered staying in as a child. The matron, long retired, still lived nearby and agreed to talk. She remembered Jamie, a quiet boy who clung to a frayed blue blanket. He didn't talk until he was almost 4, she said. But when he did, he always asked about his mother. James wept in the car afterward. When he returned home, Linda was sitting in the dark. "I went to the orphanage," he said. She didn't respond. "I'm him, aren't I?" Linda nodded once. "You're my son." A long silence stretched between them. James sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. "But I loved you. I still do." Linda's voice was hollow. "I don't know what to do." Neither of them did. James didn't sleep that night. He lay on the bed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as if the answer to everything were written in the cracks above him. His heart felt like it was being pulled in opposite directions. One screaming run, the other whispering stay. He thought back to the first time he kissed Linda. The way her lips had trembled, the way her fingers had curled into his chest like she was afraid he'd disappear. He'd never felt more needed, more loved. But now he couldn't breathe without hearing the word mom echo in his chest like a warning bell. He got out of bed at 4 a.m. and stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. He searched for traces of her, the curve of his jaw, the shape of his eyebrows, the shade of his eyes. Were these features his? Hers? Theirs? He whispered to his reflection, "What are you now?" 2 days later, James drove 4 hours to visit a man he hadn't spoken to in a decade, Reverend Alden Gray, the closest thing he'd ever had to a father figure during his teen years in foster care. They sat on opposite sides of a dusty church office, a single Bible between them. James told him everything. When he finished, the Reverend said nothing for a long time. He simply looked at James with eyes full of something James couldn't quite name. Grief? Shock? Pity? Finally, he asked, "And do you still love her?" James hesitated. "I don't know what that word means anymore." "Do you feel shame?" "Every second." "Then you're not lost," Reverend Gray said quietly. "But you are carrying something no one should ever have to." Later that week, James made an appointment with a therapist. He didn't give his real name, just JT. He sat stiffly in the chair, eyes downcast. "I need you to help me stop loving someone," he said. "Okay," the therapist replied gently. "Who?" "My mother," he whispered. The room went still. "I didn't know she was. We got married. We were happy. I loved her more than anyone. Then I found out the truth. And I still love her." He broke down, not in loud sobs, but in a way that made the therapist silently reach for tissues, unsure if they were for him or herself. At home, James tried calling Linda mom once. She flinched. He never said it again. They lived in the same house, breathing the same air, both haunted by a relationship neither asked for and a truth neither could escape. James started a journal. Page 1 simply read, "Dear Jamie, you were not born wrong. You were just born into silence. One night, he burned all their wedding photos in the fireplace, except one. The one where she was laughing in profile, a flower in her hair, and he was looking at her like she was sunrise. He kept that one in his wallet. Even when he hated himself, he couldn't destroy the memory of the one time he'd felt whole. What do you call love that shouldn't exist? What do you do with a truth so horrific that even your heartbeat feels like betrayal? For days, neither Linda nor James left the house. The curtains stayed drawn. The lights remained off. The air between them was thick with something that had no name. Not just shame or grief or confusion. It was a quiet horror, a knowing that lived in their bones now. No matter how they tried to undo it, the truth would never leave. Linda barely ate. She paced the hallways at night, whispering prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Forgive me. Forgive us. I didn't know. I didn't know. James stayed in the guest room now, a room that used to be her late husband's office, before the grief of widowhood turned it into a storage space. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think straight. His body ached like it remembered what his mind hadn't known. He had married his mother. He had touched her skin, kissed her lips, made love to her in the soft glow of morning light. And now, every memory made him want to claw at his own flesh. But what tormented him more was this unbearable truth. He still loved her. Not as a mother, as Linda. That love didn't vanish the moment the word DNA entered the room. It didn't retreat just because biology shouted over it. It stayed. It lingered. And it tore him apart. Then came the reporters. It started with an anonymous tip, someone at the DNA lab, maybe a technician with a conscience or a grudge. Within 48 hours, the story spread like wildfire. Missouri woman accidentally marries her long-lost son after DNA mix-up. Shocking incest scandal. Mother and son lived as husband and wife for 2 years. Twisted love or honest mistake. Small-town couple face loathsome truth. Their faces were on local news. Then national tabloids. Twitter. Reddit. Talk shows. They were no longer Linda and James. They were the couple who committed incest without knowing. Strangers showed up at their door, snapping pictures. A neighbor wrote "sinners" in red paint on their mailbox. Another sent a box of baby dolls, each with its head torn off. The church Linda had attended for 20 years revoked her membership. The library where she volunteered asked her to take a break. Even her closest friend, Margie, stopped answering calls. James lost his job at the clinic. His supervisor said it wasn't about the news, but they both knew it was. They were pariahs now. It didn't stop at the news headlines. Within days, their quiet neighborhood in Springfield transformed into a stage for chaos. News vans parked across the street for hours, their long camera lenses aimed at the white cottage like snipers. One station even used a drone to capture aerial footage of their backyard, where James had once danced barefoot and Linda had planted roses. A local podcast ran an episode titled Mother-Wife Monster, The Linda Carter Scandal. It went viral. Teenagers on TikTok reenacted the DNA test scene, complete with dramatic sound effects and mock crying. A popular YouTuber dubbed James Oedipus 2.0 and urged viewers to demand he be charged with incest, despite no evidence they had known the truth when marrying. Strangers drove by at night, honking their horns, some yelling slurs out their windows. One morning, Linda woke to find a cardboard sign staked into her lawn. "Keep your sickness in the house." At the grocery store, whispers followed her down the aisles. A woman deliberately bumped her cart, then hissed, "You should be ashamed." James was refused service at a local diner he used to visit every Saturday. The waitress, who once called him sweetheart, wouldn't meet his eyes. Even people they once considered friends turned cold. Their church revoked Linda's membership with a formal letter. The library where she volunteered asked her to step back for a while. Her best friend Margie blocked her number without explanation. One Sunday, someone tossed a box onto their porch. Inside were 5 plastic baby dolls, each with its head twisted off and painted red. No note, just a message too loud to ignore. Linda screamed when she saw it. James burned them in the backyard that night, but the smell lingered for days. Reporters knocked on neighbors' doors offering money for any scrap of gossip, anything to feed the insatiable public hunger. One tabloid unearthed their wedding photo and ran it with the headline, "The Day Love Died in Missouri." James tried to call the media mistaken, but no one cared about details. In the court of public opinion, nuance had no place. The weight of shame, not for what they'd done, but how it was seen, began to crush them. They started keeping the curtains drawn, answer no calls, ignore the mail. Their home, once filled with warmth and routine, pot roast on Sundays, calligraphy on Tuesdays, turned into a bunker. And slowly, Linda and James stopped speaking. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion. There were no words left. One evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Linda sat on the bathroom floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She stared at the bathtub faucet, thinking about how easy it would be to turn it on, fill the tub, and just stop being. James found her there at dawn, shivering and soaked in tears. "You can't leave me," he said softly. She looked at him with hollow eyes. "I already did." He helped her up, dried her hair, made her tea, but no warmth passed between them. They were just 2 ghosts moving through the same haunted house. Later that week, Linda filed for an annulment. The clerk who processed the paperwork didn't look her in the eye. James refused to sign. "I didn't know you were my mother," he said, voice low. "We didn't choose this. I won't be punished for something I never intended." Linda stared at him, unable to respond. Deep down, part of her understood, but another part wanted to disappear just to make the pain stop. The media frenzy only worsened. Documentaries, YouTube breakdowns, amateur sleuths digging through hospital records. One tabloid published an old photo of their wedding, calling it "The Day Love Died in Missouri." A few weeks later, a strange woman showed up at their porch. Mid-50s, leather jacket, hard eyes. She claimed to be one of James's former foster moms, the only one who ever cared for him. "He was a sweet boy," she said, looking Linda over with quiet contempt. "But something broke in him when they took him away. Guess now we know why." Linda slammed the door. At night, she began hearing voices. Not real ones, but echoes. A baby crying in another room, a child calling mommy, and James whispering, "I still love you." The shame sat in her lungs like water. One morning, she took her wedding ring and dropped it in the kitchen trash. James found it and placed it on her pillow. She threw out again. He retrieved it again. That night, James confronted her in the living room. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice shaking. "I want to forget," she whispered. "Then let me go." "You won't leave." "Because you won't let me." The argument grew louder, angrier. Linda called him sick. He called her a coward. He knocked over a vase. She slapped him. He shouted something about fate and God's mistake. She screamed that he was a reminder of everything she lost. Then silence. They stood there, gasping, trembling, the air between them crackling like dry leaves ready to catch fire. "I need you to move out," she finally said. James didn't speak. He just turned, walked to the guest room, and closed the door. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. And somewhere, in the space between rage and despair, between guilt and longing, a crack began to form. A crack that would soon become a fracture. A fracture that would lead to blood on the floor. The next few days passed in aching silence. James didn't leave the house. He moved like a ghost. a shadow of the vibrant young man who once danced barefoot on the lawn with a woman who called him her second chance. Now he barely spoke, ate once a day, sat by the window, staring into the dark yard like it owed him answers. Linda tried to write. She sat at the kitchen table each morning with a blank sheet of paper and a pen in her trembling hand. She told herself she was writing her story, a letter, a confession, maybe a plea for forgiveness. But the words never came. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. One morning, she found James in the hallway, staring at an old photo of her and Brian, her late husband. His face was unreadable. Was he better than me? James asked without turning. He was your father, Linda replied softly. I don't mean that, James said, finally facing her. I mean, was he better than me? She didn't answer. There was no answer that would have made sense. That night, Linda locked her bedroom door. James knocked once, then again, then harder. Please open the door, he said, barely holding himself together. I just want to talk. She didn't respond. Linda, no, Mom, please. Please talk to me. Still silence. Eventually, the knocking stopped. She heard his footsteps retreat, followed by the sound of a cabinet opening, then closing, then nothing. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, this has to end. The next morning, she made a decision. She showered, dressed in soft gray slacks and a white blouse, and walked to the attorney's office down the street. She wanted to file a restraining order. Not because James had hurt her, he never had, but because she needed to feel like she had control again. She didn't tell him. She just left the papers on the kitchen counter, signed and notarized. When James saw them that afternoon, he stood frozen. His hand shook. You really think I'd hurt you? He muttered. Linda stood across the room, arms folded. I don't know what to think anymore. That's the problem. His jaw tightened. So that's it. I'm not your wife. I can't be your mother either. I'm just what's left. James slammed his fist onto the counter, the loud crack making her jump. Don't talk like that. Don't pretend I didn't matter. Tears welled in her eyes. You mattered too much. They stared at each other, breathless and raw. For a moment, it looked like he might break down again, the way he had so many times in the past weeks. But this time, something was different. This time, something inside him snapped. He grabbed his coat and stormed out. James didn't come back that night. Linda locked every door, sat by the fireplace with a kitchen knife hidden under a throw blanket. She didn't sleep. Her mind ran wild with what-ifs and memories and the sound of his voice echoing. You mattered too much. By morning, she felt hollow. She brewed coffee, fed the birds outside, sat on the porch, and watched the leaves fall. For a brief moment, everything felt still, like the storm had passed. Then he returned. James walked up the driveway, just as she stood from the porch swing. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled. In his hand was a small black box. He stepped slowly onto the porch. What is that? She asked, wary. He opened the box. Inside was her wedding ring, the one she'd thrown away. I dug through 3 bags of garbage to find this, he said, because I thought it still meant something. Linda's voice shook. You shouldn't have come back. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what your lawyer says. We didn't ask for this, Linda. We didn't know. But we know now, she whispered. And that changes everything. He stepped closer. Too close. She backed away. James, please don't. You said I was your miracle, he said, his voice rising. You said I was the light at the end of the tunnel. And then I found out I was the tunnel, she snapped. A place you were never supposed to be. That's when he lost control. With a sudden burst of rage, he lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. Linda screamed, twisting away. She tripped on the edge of the porch step and fell backward onto the walkway. Her head hit the brick path with a sickening thud. Everything went still. James froze, staring in horror as Linda's eyes fluttered, then went still. Blood pooled beneath her head. Her chest didn't rise. Linda, he whispered, Mom! He dropped to his knees, cradled her limp body, and screamed into the quiet air, a sound so raw it made the crows flee from the trees. A neighbor heard the commotion and called 911. When paramedics arrived, they found James sitting on the porch steps, rocking back and forth, his hands and shirt soaked in blood. At the police station, he didn't resist. He told them everything. The love, the wedding, the DNA, the pain, the fight. I didn't mean to hurt her, he sobbed. I just wanted her to love me. I just wanted to belong. He was charged with second-degree manslaughter. The media pounced. From marriage to murder. The incest case that shook America. DNA disaster. Missouri man kills biological mother turned wife. Love, lies, and blood. The unthinkable tragedy of Linda and James. The trial of James Taylor began 7 months after Linda Carter's death. By then, the media circus had only grown louder. Documentaries had already aired. Talk shows had dissected every minute of their story. Pundits and pastors called it everything from a tragedy to an abomination. But in the quiet, wood-paneled courtroom in Greene County, Missouri, there was no room for sensationalism. Only the law and the truth, or at least what could be proven. James entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. He looked older, thinner. The softness in his eyes had faded, replaced by a dull stare that hovered somewhere between grief and exhaustion. The courtroom was packed. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters sketched furiously. The prosecution called it what it was: a tragic but avoidable death. A man so consumed by his forbidden feelings that he lashed out when they were rejected. They argued that James had a history of obsession, that his refusal to move out or accept the annulment showed a pattern of coercive control. They pointed to the signed restraining order Linda had filed just days before her death as evidence of fear. And they replayed the 911 audio where James had screamed, "I didn't mean to. She just wouldn't listen." But the defense painted a different picture. His public defender, a quiet woman named Marla Jensen, delivered a closing statement that left the room in silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client did not grow up in a loving home. He grew up without a name, without a mother, without a history. He wasn't told who he was until it was too late. What James and Linda experienced was not evil. It was tragic, and on that porch, he didn't commit murder. He panicked. He didn't mean to kill her. He meant to stop her from walking away again. The woman he had just found. The mother he'd never known. The love he couldn't unlearn." Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. The prosecution called him dangerous. The defense called him damaged. But both sides agreed. What happened between James and Linda was not normal. Not forgivable, but not simple. Over the course of the trial, dozens of witnesses took the stand. A former neighbor testified how she saw Linda change after James moved in, glowing again after years of gray. Another recalled how quiet James had always been, how he once spent an entire Saturday fixing her mailbox without being asked. But the most chilling testimony came from a nurse at the DNA lab. "We don't usually contact people directly," she said, fidgeting under cross-examination. But their results, they weren't typical. "We felt a moral obligation." When asked if she believed the couple had known they were mother and son at the time of their marriage, she shook her head. "No," she said firmly. There was no deception, just tragedy. The courtroom was heavy with silence. The prosecution leaned hard into the 911 audio. They replayed it 3 times. James's voice screaming, "I didn't mean to. She just wouldn't listen." Each time, Linda's name echoed in the speakers like a ghost that wouldn't leave. They called it emotional manipulation, said James had tried to assert control when Linda chose distance, that he was unwilling to let go, even after discovering the truth. They pointed to the restraining order as a final plea for separation. This was not love, the prosecutor declared. It was delusion, desperation, and finally violence. But the defense painted a different portrait. They brought out Linda's journal. Selected passages read aloud, with soft, deliberate pacing. He makes me feel like the world hasn't forgotten me. When he holds me, I forget the years. If he is my son, then God forgive me, because I still love him. Some jurors lowered their eyes. A clinical psychologist also took the stand, explaining the phenomenon of genetic sexual attraction, a rare but documented occurrence when long-lost biological relatives meet in adulthood with no shared memories and unknowingly develop romantic bonds. It's not a choice, the expert said. It's biology colliding with psychology, an emotional vacuum desperate to be filled. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. One juror cried openly. During the sentencing phase, the judge allowed James to speak. He stood, shackled and shaking. I didn't want this, he said, barely louder than a whisper. We didn't know. We didn't know who we were. But when we found out, we broke. I broke. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to carry what I did that day. He paused, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. This is from her journal, he said. I found it the day after she died. He read, what do you do when the person who makes you feel alive turns out to be the reason you wish you were dead? The courtroom was so still you could hear the ticking of the clock. The judge recessed for deliberation. After 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the first degree. Sentence, 10 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 6. Some called the sentence too lenient. Others called it merciful. For James, it didn't matter. There's no number of years that can match the weight I feel, he told his lawyer. I already got a life sentence the day she died. James was transferred to the Missouri Department of Corrections. His first year inside was quiet. He kept to himself, declined interviews, never spoke during visitation hours. Some inmates called him the incest guy. Others avoided him entirely. But over time, he found a strange sort of rhythm. He joined a writing group. He volunteered in the prison's hospice ward. And every year, on the anniversary of Linda's death, he sat alone in the chapel with nothing but a folded photograph in his hand. Their wedding picture. The one the tabloids had once plastered across their front pages. He never burned it. He never could. After 6 years, James was granted parole. No cameras greeted him outside. No family. No friends. Just a cold wind and a man with a duffel bag, stepping into a world that had long since moved on without him. He moved to a small town in northern Colorado, changed his name, and took a job cleaning cabins at a lakeside resort. Quiet work. Forgettable work. That's what he wanted now. To disappear, to fade, to carry her memory in silence. In a rare interview granted to a local reporter years later, James said, "There's not a day I don't think about her, and not a night I don't dream she's still alive. Sometimes she's holding a baby. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes we're on the porch again, dancing to that song. People think I'm a monster, but the truth is, I was just a boy who wanted to be loved, and I loved the one person I never should have." Linda was buried next to her first husband, Brian Carter. Her headstone read, "Beloved Mother, may peace find what truth could not." But in her will, revised only weeks before her death, she left behind a letter addressed to James. It arrived at the prison long after the trial, written in her delicate handwriting. "James, my son, my love, I don't know what we were, but I know what you were to me, a home. I wish I had met you differently. I wish I had held you longer that day you were born. But I'm proud of the man you became, even if our story ended in pain. Live, please live, for both of us." James never showed that letter to anyone until now. The reporter asked why he'd finally agreed to share it. James looked out the window, eyes distant. "Because people think this was a crime story," he said. But really, it was a love story, the most tragic one I'll ever tell. Autumn in Colorado carried a different kind of silence than Missouri. Up here, the wind moved slowly between pine trees. The lake reflected the changing leaves like stained glass, untouched and unbothered. It was the kind of place people came to forget. And that's exactly why James Taylor, or whatever name he used now, had chosen it. He lived in a one-room cabin behind the resort where he worked. No TV, no internet, just books, a kettle, and the radio that played old country music at low volume during the day. Each morning, he swept the porch, brewed coffee, and walked the same dirt trail that looped along the lake's edge. In summer, he fed the ducks. In winter, he watched the world freeze over and wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was what he needed too. But some things don't freeze. Some things stay burning under the surface, even after prison, even after time. One of those things was Linda. Every year on October 14th, the day she died, James returned to Missouri for exactly 24 hours. He never stayed overnight. He didn't visit old neighbors or pass by the house they once shared. He went straight to the cemetery and sat cross-legged in front of her grave. Her headstone was simple. Linda M. Carter, beloved mother. May peace find what truth could not. He always brought two things, a blue blanket, folded carefully beside her headstone, and a single yellow daffodil, her favorite flower. He never spoke out loud, but if someone were close enough to listen, they might have heard his lips move. I'm still here, still breathing. You were the only person who ever saw me, and the one I wish I'd never met. Some years he stayed for minutes, others for hours. But every time, when he rose to leave, he walked away a little older, a little more hollow, a little more forgiven. In the spring of his 45th year, James received a letter from a young woman named Erin Carlson, a journalism student who had stumbled across his case while writing a paper on judicial ethics. She'd requested an interview. He ignored the first few, but on her fourth attempt, she wrote, "I'm not here to judge you. I want to know the part no one else asked about. What it meant to love someone before you knew who they were, and to keep loving them after you did." James invited her to Colorado. They met at a diner near the highway. She brought a recorder. He brought nothing but himself and the wedding photo, now crinkled and faded at the edges. The interview lasted 4 hours. She asked him everything about Linda, about the day she died, about the prison years, the nightmares, the silence. At the end, she asked, "Do you think it was love or something else?" James sipped his coffee, then replied, "It was love, the kind no one should ever have to carry, the kind that doesn't ask questions until it's too late." Months later, Erin's article went viral. Titled, "The Man Who Married His Mother, A Love Story Buried in Shame," it spread across the internet like wildfire. Some readers wept, others raged, some left cruel comments, but many, surprisingly many, wrote things like, "I can't stop thinking about them. This is the saddest story I've ever read. He didn't choose this. None of them did." People began to see not monsters, but human beings, broken in a way most of us pray will never understand. On the last day of his life, James walked his usual trail around the lake. He wore a dark sweater, the same blue as the blanket he used to bring to Linda's grave. At a clearing just past mile marker 3, he sat on a log, pulled out a notebook, and wrote, "I don't ask for peace anymore. I ask for understanding. For her. For me. For whoever reads this someday and doesn't look away." That evening, a heart attack took him quietly in his sleep. He was found the next morning by a cabin guest who'd come to borrow extra towels. There was no funeral, no obituary, but Erin Carlson posted a tribute online that read, "He died the same way he lived after her, alone, but not unloved." Some stories are too strange for fiction. Some are too tragic for judgment. This was both. Linda Carter never meant to marry her son. James Taylor never meant to fall in love with his mother. But between loss and loneliness, silence and chance, their lives collided in a way no one saw coming. Not even them. In another life, they could have been a happy mother and son, reunited after decades apart. But in this life, they were a love story the world couldn't understand. And maybe they never would.